IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another Friday episode of All Things Policy. Today we're going to be talking about syncretic practices in South India. Some of you may have heard an earlier Friday episode that I did with my friend Vivek Joseph, who is returning here today. Thank you for being here, Vivek.
It's great to be back, Anirudh. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So the last time, Vivek, we spoke a little bit about this very fascinating deity called Mallanna or Khandoba, and how both Hindus and Muslims participate in his rituals, and how the local legends and the local interactions between various communities are reflected in the way that Mallanna is worshipped. We also touched upon a few other interesting deities and interactions, especially in Kerala. And today, instead, we're going to be talking about another part of South India. We're going to be talking about Tamil Nadu, and we're going to be talking about yet another fascinating example of syncretism and of different religious communities practicing very similar kind of religious practices. The example that Vivek is going to be telling us about today is about Catholic saints who are worshipped by Hindus, and also Hindu local deities who are worshipped by Christian Catholics. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the actual practices themselves, the history, how exactly these practices came to originate. Without any further ado, let's actually get to the meat of the discussion. Vivek, tell us about these shrines where Hindus worship Catholic saints.
So across Tamil Nadu, across South India, but across Tamil Nadu in particularly, there are various shrines that are thronged by devotees, not only Catholics, but many who identify as Hindu and occasionally identify as Muslim as well. So I thought we kind of discuss about three shrines that are pretty popular in Tamil Nadu.
Sure.
And the first is a shrine dedicated to a saint called John de Brito. And it's in a village called Orur or Oriur, that's on the southeast coast of Tamil Nadu. And John de Brito is a pretty interesting figure. He was a missionary, a Portuguese missionary of the Jesuit order who came to South India in the late 17th century. And he preached to various coastal peoples in Tamil Nadu. John de Brito is pretty interesting for the fact that he dressed up as a sannyasi, essentially, and he dressed up in orange, he adopted a vegetarian diet, and he began preaching. The communities that he particularly reached out to were primarily Dalit and Bahujan communities who lived along the coast, and particularly three related castes. They're part of a confederacy in that part of Tamil Nadu called the Mukkulator, and they include these castes called the Marwars, the Kalars, and the Odayars. Now, John de Brito soon became a very popular sacred figure in the region, so much so that the local ruler, the Setupati, decided that he was a threat. And he ordered John de Brito to be arrested, and he was led to what is now the village of Orur, and then beheaded and impaled.
Damn.
And the blood that he is said to have shed is what has stained the sand on the beach of Orur. So if you go to Orur, the sand is red, and that's believed to have been stained by the blood of John de Brito. So Brito called himself Arulanandam. Arul kind of loosely translates to divine joy or happiness. It's a pretty hard term to really have a direct English translation for. And Ananda means joy. So he adopted that Tamil name, and that's how he's generally referred to amongst Tamil Catholics. And soon Orur became a very popular shrine for local Catholics, particularly from the castes that John de Brito preached to and John de Brito converted. Interestingly, devotion to John de Brito by these castes is it's a very caste-centric phenomena, and does not depend on religious affiliation.
Interesting.
What I mean by that is that individuals from these castes who identify as Hindu would still make it a point to visit the shrine and to pay homage, or in most cases worship John de Brito as such. And they consider many Catholics and many Hindu Marvas, Colors, and Udayas consider John de Brito their Kuladevam. Now, the term Kuladevam is interesting because in a Catholic context, it would translate to a patron saint, and this is a pretty ancient phenomenon within Catholicism, wherein a saint becomes a patron for an individual, a family, a settlement, or in an entire country.
Right.
And that sort of fits in quite well with the tradition of Kuladevams in the subcontinent, particularly in South India, wherein you have deities who act as patrons for families or castes. And in the case of John de Brito here in Orur, he acts as the Kuladevam, as the protector for both Catholic and Hindu members of these caste communities. And so during the annual festival, falls on the date when John de Brito was killed. And during that annual festival, thousands of devotees make their way to Orur. In fact, some estimates say that about 35 to 40% of those devotees are Hindu, identify as Hindu. And they perform various acts of vow making and vow fulfillment. So in Tamil, it's usually, there are various terms for the system of vow taking and vow fulfillment, but essentially the most common term, especially in the Catholic context, is nerchai. Even Malayali Christians often use the term nercha to refer to a phenomenon wherein they take vows to Christ or to a patron saint that they would perform a certain act of thanksgiving if their intention is granted. It's a phenomenon we see across religious communities in the subcontinent.
My mother actually promised a whole bunch of gods that she would donate my hair to them if I did well on my 10th grade board exams. So I can relate to that.
Exactly. So the phenomena of tonsure, the phenomena of head shaving is also pretty prevalent amongst Tamil Catholics and other Catholic communities in South India. So both Catholics and Hindus who come to John de Brito's shrine perform acts such as head shaving, they perform animal sacrifice, as well as various other nerchai rituals, regardless of their religious affiliations. And essentially, you see that the whole intention behind it is to ensure that the saint continues to protect their communities and protect their families.
This is so interesting, Vivek. There's a few things I'd like to get into here. The first is the historical context, right? The Portuguese were actually a fairly important presence, not just in Goa, which they're generally associated with, but across much of South India, really, in the 16th, 17th centuries. We know that they were fairly active in the politics of Kerala, for example. They were getting involved in the power struggles between Kozhikode and various other polities in Kerala. And they were also fairly active in Tamil Nadu, I think, as your story is showing us. The interesting thing is that I was aware that Jesuit priests were present in Tamil Nadu because we have a whole bunch of descriptions of Nayaka courts that were written by these priests. So it's interesting to hear that they were also actually aggressively proselytizing and trying to take on the garb of Indian holy men in order to do that. So this Arulananda character seems like he must have been a very interesting guy to talk to. So one thing I'm a little curious about is like, what precisely was he essentially converting people to Catholicism? Did he preach a version of Catholicism that was centered around churches, that kind of thing? How exactly did he come to become so popular? Is that kind of information even available? And I'm also curious about these practices that kind of evolved after his death, right? First of all, the story of the sands of Orur actually being stained red by his blood. One can imagine that the sands of Orur had been red for quite a while, but the idea that they were stained red by his blood is obviously a more recent one. And it kind of shows you that it's not necessarily the quote-unquote great tradition that creates these local legends and myths, right? You very clearly have an example here of Dalit communities creating a myth that has become incorporated into India's fabric of legends. I also want to ask you, you mentioned that animal sacrifice is one of the things that his devotees perform. Now, who are the priests that officiate over this kind of thing? Are they Catholics? Are they local priests belonging to these communities? What kind of rituals really are these? I'm assuming that they're not chanting verses in Sanskrit, for example, while these animals are being sacrificed.
So with regards to Arulanandam's technique of proselytization, his basic intention was to convert local communities into Catholicism. But John de Brito's practices, his methodology was actually pretty different from the mainstream Catholic method of doing things.
Obviously. I mean, what did they think of him, really? Do you have any idea whether he was considered to have been a heretic for going about in saffron robes?
I think there was a lot of controversy with regards to how he went about, essentially acting as an upper caste Hindu for the purpose of becoming more acceptable within caste-ridden Hindu society. He had there was an Italian priest, an Italian Jesuit named Robert De Nobili, who did the same thing, and he operated in something known as the Madurai mission. And the purpose of the Madurai mission was to try and make Catholicism more accessible, or rather than accessible, more appealing to caste Hindus. And so there is a bit of a problematic here because, ironically, though John de Brito took upon the garb of a sannyasi to reach out to upper caste Hindu communities, he's very fondly remembered by communities that are generally classified as Shudra or lower caste or Dalit.
Out of the caste system.
So it's quite an interesting thing because his contemporaries, his Jesuit contemporaries who operated in other parts of Tamil Nadu, actively worked amongst Dalit communities and Bahujan communities. They didn't really. Again, it was complex. It often depended on the individual missionaries' intentions or his views of how to go about converting. But primarily, most missionaries did reach out to Dalit and Bahujan communities. And Robert de Nobili and John de Brito's methods were quite different. I think they are still quite controversial, both from the perspective of, let's say, the Catholic hierarchy, as well as when we analyze the caste dynamics that play out in how they went about things. So with regards to the other question regarding who officiates these practices such as animal sacrifice, there aren't any priests involved. It's solely something that's done by devotees or pilgrims to the shrine. Occasionally, you might have a Catholic priest who comes and blesses the animal, but that's a very rare occurrence. It might happen in very small shrines, but generally, a group of devotees would bring the sacrificial animal on their own, sort of present it to the saint, and then it's not that the actual sacrifice is conducted within the premises of the church. In smaller shrines they are, but often it's taken outside and the animal is killed. And then the meat is shared out in the form of a communal meal. And wherein often in a lot of these shrines, there is an insistence that this meal is shared amongst individuals from various castes and religious communities. So it sort of reinforces the idea that these spaces are open to various communities, regardless of their caste and religious affiliations.
That's quite interesting. So we essentially have a deity who was popular among, who was an actual historical figure who was popular among a particular caste, whose death was so impactful upon the oral histories or sense of identity of this caste that he came to be worshipped as a deity who protected their caste, and they ended up creating essentially sacred spaces where people across religious denominations and then from across caste boundaries also began to participate in his rituals. And this is very interesting to me, Vivek, because it kind of brings up a whole bunch of interesting questions on the nature of identity really in pre-modern India, right? And this is something that we touched upon our last podcast as well. is that very often, more than religious denominations, your caste affiliation was really what defined your identity. And this idea of quote unquote religious purity and orthodoxy was something that was more applicable to the uppermost sections of society. And even then, it wasn't necessarily in the same way as it is today. And for the vast majority of people, the way they engaged with religion was, I mean, I hesitate to use the term, but it just feels a lot more organic than the way that these religious boundaries are thought of today. So that's a very interesting story. So you had a couple of other interesting sites that you said you want to bring up. So why don't you tell us a little bit about them?
So the next slide is actually linked to your first question about whether about how conversion generally played out in the Tamil lands, and like I said, John de Brito was a bit of an exception. The next site is in a village called Overi, which is pretty close to Kanyakumari, and Overi is populated primarily by a caste community called the Parvas. The Parvas are a pretty interesting community because most Parvas are Catholic. In fact, they were converted in about the 16th century by a particularly popular Jesuit missionary who's now a saint known as Francis Xavier, and who's sort of infamous for the Goan Inquisition, etc. Francis Xavier worked pretty extensively along the coast of Kerala and Tamil Nadu and parts of Sri Lanka too. And he was quite influential in the conversion of the Parvas, and the Parvas converted en masse. There are various reasons why they did it, partly economic, partly social. We won't really get into that, but the shrine in Overi is dedicated to a saint called Anthony of Padua. And Anthony of Padua is a particularly popular saint in Catholicism across the world. He's one of the doctors of the Catholic Church, which means that he was very instrumental in contributing towards the development of theology and doctrine within Catholicism. But he's most popularly known for being the patron of lost things, which basically means that, for example, this is something that my mom does. This is something my mom does quite often. If you lose something, and it can be the smallest thing, you essentially ask Anthony to help you find it, and he does. But that's why he's pretty popular across the Catholic world. He's also known for his powers for fertility. But in Overi particularly, Anthony is known for his ability to control malevolent spirits and to destroy the effects of black magic and sorcery. So the way the actual shrine at Overi kind of came about was according to legend, about 450 years ago, a Portuguese trading ship was passing by. Overi had a port called Obir Pattanam, and where Portuguese ships often stopped at. And the crew of that particular ship were cholera, and immediately one of the crewmen began chipping a plank of wood, and he carved a statue of Anthony out of it. And as soon as he finished carving the statue of Anthony, the entire crew was healed. And around that time, they docked at Obir Pattanam, and in gratitude to Anthony, they installed a little shrine for him there. And so for the next several centuries, the shrine was actually taken care of by a Hindu family before in about the 1940s, a church was built around it. So a great deal of the devotees, about a local estimate say that about 40% of the devotees who come to St. Anthony's Shrine at Overi are Hindus, and they primarily come for healing from the effects of black magic and sorcery. So like at John de Brito's Shrine, they perform Nerchai rituals such as animal sacrifice. They also perform an act of feeding 13 individuals. So St. Anthony's feast day, that is the day he died, is June 13th. So in honor of that, they feed 13 individuals from different caste and religious communities. Often you find Hindu families who have made a vow to Anthony coming and offering and feeding 13 individuals in fulfillment of their vows. So those are the kind of very interesting dynamics of ovary. And St. Anthony is particularly known for his ability to. So occasionally, the individuals who come having been negatively affected by black magic and sorcery, or are often also possessed by local spirits. And Anthony is believed to have the power to exorcise these spirits. And occasionally, these can be local deities too, or the effects or the curses of local deities that are inflicted upon an individual or a family for not observing a certain ritual or for disrespecting the deity. So, interestingly, instead of really making reparations to the local deity themselves, they come to Anthony to find a cure for it. So there is sort of kind of an interaction, sort of a blending of these two sacred spaces. You have a Catholic space that is sort of dominated by a rigid structure, a rigid hierarchical structure. At the same time, you have a local religious culture that sort of blends together with it. And you have individuals who sort of take refuge in one sacred space when they find themselves having offended deities from another.
That's a very interesting way of putting it. And I really wonder how this idea that Saint Anthony could control local deities really came about, right? So he clearly has a space within the hierarchy of local deities, as it were. So do we have any idea how this happened, Vivek? Like how old really are these practices, and how did the shrine at Ovary like kind of grow to the kind of popularity that it has today? And also, can you tell us a little bit more about the kind of pilgrims who come there? You mentioned that people who think they've offended local deities do that, so I'm assuming they come across religious denominations. But also, who are these? For example, these 13 social groups who are fed on his feast day. How deeply connected are they to the history of Ovary itself, or is there a kind of trans-regional or trans-local character to the worship of Antony there?
With regards to how these traditions sort of developed, I think it is rooted in local religious practices. And when Catholicism arrived in the region, it didn't exactly supplant these practices, but rather blended with them. And so an interesting point to note is, just as certain caste communities, families from certain caste communities consider John de Brito their Kuladevam, many Hindu devotees who come to St. Anthony's shrine in Ovary, either consider him their Kuladevam or adopt him as their Kuladevam. And it finally kind of boils down to this idea of a supernatural figure be acting as a protector against disease and calamity. This is something that we see quite extensively across local religious practices in the subcontinent, wherein ritual acts are performed to appease local deities to ensure that they protect devotees for a period of time. Usually, these rituals are performed periodically to ensure that the deities remain happy. In Tamil Nadu, this is particularly true with the worship of Amman deities. And Amman deities are local goddesses, local mother goddesses, who control diseases such as measles, poxes, etc., as well as who control rains and who control farming patterns, etc. And so local communities generally perform rituals to these Amman deities. I think ritual is a bit of a tricky term to use as well, because it's not necessarily textually prescribed. These are generally acts of sacrifice, or which don't really have any priest or anyone involved. It's usually a devotee or his or her family who generally performs the act, and then they partake of the communal meal. They share it with their neighbors, with other members in the village, and so there's no fixed textual prescription towards how these Amman deities need to be appeased, but they are appeased, and it's quite necessary for the safety of the village and the safety of the community and the safety of families and individuals that good relations are maintained with the Ammans, because essentially the Ammans are providers and protectresses at the same time. So to ensure, steady rainfall, to ensure that villages are protected from plagues of any sort. It's up to it's up to individuals, it's up to entire communities sometimes to simultaneously perform ritual acts of of vow taking, of thanksgiving, of offering to ensure the peace and stability of the village. And so when Catholicism came in to South India, like I mentioned earlier, with patron saints, it sort of follows a similar idea wherein you have a patron saint who will kind of look after your welfare. Now, I do need to specify something quite clearly, that within Catholicism, these saints aren't seen as deities. At least within the official within official church teaching. So a Catholic devotee who goes to a saint doesn't is praying to the saint, but isn't exactly expecting the saint to grant their intention himself or herself. Rather, they are asking the saint to intercede for them to God. So the saint acts as a medium between the human and the divine. Of course, when it comes to practice, I think the lines between worship and veneration are quite fine. So technically, Catholics, Orthodox Christians, as well as other denominations who honor saints, who have a tradition of saints, venerate them. That is, they don't worship these individuals, but they give them respect and they honor them. When it comes to the subcontinent, and with our traditions of respecting and honoring individuals we consider sacred or holy or important in any way, they often do border or often do overlap with rituals or acts that you would perform when you are paying your respects to a deity. So in that sense, when it comes to practice, the lines between worship and veneration are quite fine. So when Catholicism comes into South India, with the average Catholic devotee, while they are essentially supposed to be asking for the intercession of these patron saints for protection, they are doing so in a way that's very similar to individuals who practice local religious practices, who are asking the Amman deities, for example, or other local deities for protection. And these include acts such as Nechai rituals, acts of head shaving, acts of animal sacrifice, etc. So it sort of fits quite snugly. It's sort of an overlapping between two religious traditions in many ways. And it kind of makes us question and where these lines exactly lie, because there's no real way of drawing lines between these religious traditions when it comes to spaces such as Overi or spaces such as Orur.
This is okay. This is so much to unpack here. So sorry for cutting in, but I mean, damn, like there's just the strange kind of synergy, as it were, or the same this interesting kind of convergent evolution, if I can use that term, where you have these two very different societies, these two very different religions that originate in very different parts of the world, that still somehow start to come up with this idea of these figures that aren't exactly, like the figures of the quote unquote great tradition, right? They're not the Holy Trinity. They're not Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, whatever big god is out there. But they're more intricately interwoven with the fabric of daily life. Saint Anthony is a great example. The fact that I had no idea that he was worshipped because he was a patron saint of lost things, that people actually worshipped him to, for example, find, I don't know if they lose their keys or their phone or something like that. But it makes sense. And it's interesting to see that he originates in this particular context. And then when he comes with the Portuguese and other Catholics to India in the early modern period, they find there a society that is already very much used to venerating local deities, who again are very interwoven with the fabric of daily life, right? And especially this idea of appeasement, this idea that the goddesses will protect you and they will nurture you, but they are also, they can be a little irascible, so you have to stay on their good side. And then this new system, which also has these local deities, comes in, and through a totally unexpected set of historical events involving, sailors getting cholera and so on. This deity ends up, the Saint Anthony ends up being considered to be a local deity like any other. In fact, a local deity that's a little more powerful in a sense than the other ones, and is therefore able to kind of bring them under control, and who can ensure that they aren't too pissed off at you. How fascinating! It's you can't make this kind of stuff up. It's so interesting to see how these similarities kind of organically lead to new traditions emerging. So this is absolutely fascinating. I can't wait to hear what this third shrine is going to be like, and what is going to tell us about the way that communities interacted in early modern India. Go ahead, Vivek.
So while Saint Anthony and Saint John the Baptist are pretty popular saints, they in no way beat the popularity of the Virgin Mary, or popularly known as Mother Mary, the Mother of Christ. Mary is, with Catholics particularly, Catholics are supposed to be quite obsessed with Mary, and it is true to a certain extent. Mary is an extremely popular figure within Catholicism. Again, she is not considered a goddess, but rather a mother figure who acts as an intercessor between humans and God, and her son, Jesus, basically. So Mary becomes even, if Mary was already popular in the rest of the Catholic world, Mary becomes even more popular in India, and particularly within Tamil Catholicism. And so the third shrine I kind of want to talk about is the shrine of Our Lady of Velankani. Velankani is a village. Okay, it's now a town because of the pilgrimage business. It's grown quite a lot in recent years. That's close to the city of Nagapattinam on the eastern coast of Tamil Nadu. Similar to the legend of how Anthony ended up in Ovary, so the Virgin Mary is first said to have appeared to two local boys at different instances. These, in the Catholic term for it, is apparition. So she appeared with Jesus in her arms and instructed these boys to kind of establish a local shrine to her. And already a lot of communities in the area had already converted into Catholicism by this point of time. So we're talking about late 16th century or so, early 17th century. Later on, a Portuguese ship again happens to be passing by Velankani, and it gets caught in a storm. And the captain of the ship prays to Mary and tells her that if we are saved, then wherever we dock, I will build a shrine for you there. And the storm is abated, and they dock at Velankani, and they set up a little chapel there, and eventually the chapel keeps growing. And Mary in Velankani is venerated as Our Lady of Good Health. So the thing with Mary is she's kind of given titles by the church for various things. So while saints generally are patrons for certain things, like Anthony is patron for lost things, for example, and in the case of Ovary, patron for those who are possessed. Mary is patron for quite a wide variety of things, and in Velankani, she is particularly the patron of good health. In Tamil, she's known as Arogya Mata, or the Mother of Health. And Mary, so the Our Lady of Velankani shrine is the most popular Marian shrine, i.e., the most popular shrine dedicated to Mary in the subcontinent. It gets about 20 million pilgrims a year, and about a recent
20 million?
20 million, yes. And recent estimates show that about 35% of them are not Catholic, so they're primarily individuals who identify as Hindu, or occasionally even Muslim devotees as well. Muslim because Mary is actually quite honored within Islamic tradition. So it's sort of in South India particularly, it's not uncommon to see Muslim pilgrims making their way to Marian shrines. So she is a patron of good health, and for most of these Hindu devotees of Mary, they primarily come from Dalit and Bahujan communities, and Mary is often considered another Amman goddess, and to use a more Sanskritized term which developed recently, she's considered a form of Shakti. And that fits into our a discussion about how Anthony fits in within local beliefs of supernatural beings being protectors and providers. Mary, in this case, protects communities, protects individuals, and ensures that they have good health, just like an Amman deity would. So the most popular Amman deity in Tamil Nadu would be Mariamman, and Mariamman is particularly well known for her control over measles and smallpox. And in the same way, Mary is like Mariamman, an individual, a supernatural being. For Catholics, a saint, a motherly figure. For Hindu devotees, a goddess who protects them from disease and calamity. So it's sort of, this is not just for Tamil Nadu. You see the popularity of Mary with a lot of Dalit Bahujan communities across South India. In Mary's shrine, so Mary has a festival on the 8th of September, which is celebrated as her birthday. And for 9 days before that, in Catholic tradition, you have something called a novena, which is 9 days of prayer that precedes a church festival. So in Overi, the festival is on June 13th. So for 9 days, you have a great deal of prayer, and devotees throng the shrine and perform various acts of offering and vow fulfillment. That's a prime time for vow fulfillment, actually. And during Mary's festival, as well as Anthony's festival and other Catholic shrines, you have things like the pulling of a chariot with the statue of Mary in it, or the statue of a saint in it, wherein Hindu devotees actively take part. They pull it's called a teir. They pull the car, or in English it's translated to as car. So they pull the car across, barefoot across the beach in Velankani. And so these spaces become, within Mary, you kind of find a space for, like in our last episode, we talked about how within Mallanna, within local deities such as Mallanna, communities are united. Again, within Mary, you find a space for communities to be united in a certain way. And they're united through a very basic need for protection and for assurance of, good health and prosperity, really.
Okay, wow. Once again, as you said, Vivek, we see this interesting kind of convergence that exists between Catholic worship of saints and the Indian worship of these mother goddesses, and it kind of and this kind of process of transplantation and interaction being very organic in once the kind of impetus is provided, once you have a kind of inciting incident, then it happens. It seems to happen fairly organically, like this incorporation of these quote unquote foreign deities into becoming very, very Indian ones, right down to them actually having what we would call temple processions, right? I mean, that's something that I would never have imagined that was actually done for Catholic saints, because something that is so integrally associated with Southern Indian religious practices, especially associated with the great gods, right? Especially Shiva, Vishnu in various areas and various forms. I had no idea this was also happening for Mary as well. I actually wanted to ask you, before we wrap up for today, a little bit about this idea of Mary being considered a form of the goddess Shakti. Now, I imagine that this is actually a fairly recent kind of idea, right? Because if she was originally considered a local goddess, then I'm not necessarily sure if the upper caste, the educated classes would have considered her to be a part of, orthodoxy in that sense. But this identification with Shakti, how exactly has that come to happen, and has it kind of impacted the way that she's seen and worshipped in any sense in recent years?
I think when it comes to identifying her as a form of Shakti, I think it more than Shakti as who's generally perceived as the wife of Shiva, or who incarnates into goddesses such as Durga and Kali. She's understood as a form of feminine power. And so with local goddesses such as Mariam and etc., who over time have come to be associated with deities from the greater tradition, in the same way, Mary has come to be talked of in similar in terms that seemingly come from the greater tradition. So I think the term Shakti would just be the general term for feminine power, rather than referring to a form of Durga. The feminine power from which Durga or Kali or other goddesses emerge. And so when local deity goddesses are assimilated into pan-Hindu traditions, such as the case with Mariamman, they are spoken of with terms that are associated with Syncretic traditions. So I learned it doesn't really, when it comes to Mary, she, again, her prime devotees, her prime non-Catholic devotees come from Dalit and Bahujan communities. And again, acts of nechai, acts of offerings made to her resemble those of local goddesses. They in no way resemble what you'd find at Orthodox shrines, etc. And I think that also, coming to the point you made about processions, religious processions being so associated with temple complexes such as for deities such as Shiva, etc. I think when you look at traditions such as processions for Mary and other Catholic saints, as well as various nechai rituals such as hair shaving or animal sacrifice, we begin to really question whether it is necessary to label certain traditions as being solely exclusive to one religion. And I think South Indian religious culture consistently questions, first of all, the idea of drawing lines between between religious systems, because clearly there is such a long tradition of these traditions intermixing and thriving really together. It also causes us to really question the tendency of us to label certain practices such as hair shaving or chariot processions as being solely of one religion. But rather we see that they are more rooted in local cultural practices rather than having being textually prescribed or being part of a certain religious tradition alone.
Well said. As a medieval India nerd, this is especially interesting to me because I've come across these very elaborate Sanskrit agamas that were composed in the Tamil country in the 12th, 13th centuries, which kind of prescribe this extremely elaborate series of rituals and goods that need to be collected, verses that need to be chanted, and various purificatory things that need to be performed in order for a chariot procession to happen. And it's fascinating to think that communities that would have had no access whatsoever to this kind of very complex, high learning in Sanskrit, nevertheless seem to kind of look at these temple processions, look at these chariot processions and decide that, hey, this is something that we want to do for our deities as well. And over the course of centuries, it gradually becomes theirs. So it becomes impossible to really draw that line and say that, as you said, Vivek, it's impossible to say that such and such religious practice is only of this religion. It's originally only of this religion, and it must only belong to this religion. To do so would be essentially to eradicate centuries of syncretic interactions that have happened in South India, and would essentially be the biggest undermining possible of our complex and syncretic historical legacy. Okay, amazing. As always, Vivek, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I learned so much from this fascinating conversation. For our listeners, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you're interested in hearing more from me or Vivek, you will find our social handles in the description. And we'll also put down perhaps links, or we will mention the names of these sites and these Catholic deities in case you want to take a look at pictures and kind of check them out for yourself. On that note, Vivek, thank you so much once again for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Anirudh.
My pleasure. And thank you all for listening to All Things Policy.
The Takshashila Institution is an independent, non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy. We have education programs lasting 1 semester and 1 year that are tailored specifically for people like you. They are all online and you can take them from anywhere. Admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate certificate program in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology policy, and health and life sciences. Visit takshashila.org.in/courses to find out more.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media, The handle is at IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle at takshashilainst or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, See It, Cred, and Global Victoria. We thank you so much for making all of this possible. So this week on Cyrus Says, Tapsi Pannu was recently featured in the Netflix original Haseen Dilruba was on. They discussed her experiences in Bollywood and a whole lot more. On Begin the Journey, Ashish Vidyarthi enlightens us with his wisdom on how one can get freedom from their own thoughts or insecurities when they communicate with others. On The Millennial Athlete, Tanvi and Shlok fill us in on all the drama from the world of sports with Wimbledon, Euros, and World Test cricket making headlines every day. On Postcards from Nowhere, Utsav Mamoria kicks off a new series, Beneath the Veneer. We travel to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, where he takes us through his first experience of encountering the Red Sea. We have a brand new show, Misconduct. It's a true crime show hosted by Ragvi, a lawyer, and Nisha, a PR pro. They tell us about the story of Cyanide Malika, the lady who offered cyanide-laden sweets to women and after they died, loot their gold. On the Global Victoria Tech Talks podcast, we showcase some compelling new tech stories coming out of Melbourne. On one episode, Pawan Srinath speaks to Joe Agan from Nelnet International, where they discuss how the pandemic has affected the edtech sector and its evolution. Another episode has Varun Girala talking to Ross Simons from Big Ant Studios about the gaming ecosystem and how they envision translating a sport to a game. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Come learn and experience the ABCDs of being queer with me, Shunetro,
and me, Farhad,
on our show, Gay BCD.
The two of us take you through our stories and experiences of being gay men in the city of Mumbai and have candid
and sometimes downright scandalous
conversations about sexuality, gay culture, and everything in between.
Catch new episodes of Gay BCD every Tuesday on the IVM Podcasts website, app, or wherever you get all your podcasts from.